Good morning and welcome back to Pine Middle School. It's 8th grade, and our first unit has to do with immigration and industrialization. We'll spend the next 3 weeks on this topic. If you missed the set of notes, I'm just going to briefly go over them here. You're welcome to use the fill in the blank page that I provide to students in order to get those details, and make sure that you're working on your study guide consistently over the next couple weeks. As you can see, America is not a single ethnic group nation. You take a look at, for example, the American Southeast, it's heavily African American. You take a look at the Southwest, you've got a large number of Mexican and Mexican Americans. Way up north near Canada, Scandinavians tend to dominate. So although there are many different ethnicities, just like human nature, we do tend to clump ourselves into regional groups. But the biggest clumping that's going to occur in the 1800s is called national growth, and that is urbanization. Urbanization is where the number of people in cities grows more than the people who are living on the farm. And this is because farmers start something called the agricultural revolution. The idea is they can grow more food with less people. Now that's going to pull more people into cities who are looking for jobs. That's a big deal. And there just aren't enough people in the United States to fill that need. So immigration is really going to increase during and after the Civil War. It's offering cheap labor for these new growing factories. Even how we put together our cities is different. I'll show you an example in a second. But in the United States, especially in the 1800s, we use a grid system of equal-sized streets. So, for example, when you look at Copenhagen or Barcelona, London, or Rome, which is over 2,000 years old, it's very organic. There's no plan. San Francisco, New York, Toronto are all cities in the New World, and they very much have a plan. Well, these cities are also going to lead to the growth of mass transportation. So mass transit includes things like streetcars, railroad, cable cars, and that's important because it allows the rich, the wealthy classes, in order to move to the outskirts of town or even out of town entirely. The unintended consequence of that is the poor and immigrants, minorities tend to move to the inner part of the city. Now, take a look, for example, at Reno. This is from last year, 2020. The colors basically represent the median household income. So blue, the household income is over $100,000 a year. Red, dark red, is less than $10,000 a year. And it shows you in the Reno-Sparks area, the center of our community tends to have the poorest people. So even today, we tend to see similar consequences that they did in the 1800s with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Talk about crowded conditions, unsanitary conditions. This is an image from right around 1903 in New York City. As you can see, there's animals, food, people, all within close quarters. It's very difficult at this time in order to live a healthy, long life. This is also the time that we call the Gilded Age. This is when business owners were getting super rich. One of the things that we covered in the lesson this week is millionaires would light their cigars with $100 bills. This idea that they saw money almost without value because they had so much of it. Whereas workers are going to suffer under pretty horrific circumstances. And the business owners were fine with it for the most part because they really were proponents of social Darwinism. It's the idea of survival of the fittest. You're lazy, or you're incapable of succeeding, of course you're poor. The rich, on the other hand, don't have those issues. That's why they're rich. And so it was a way for people to justify their station in life and also not really doing much to help the lower classes. But the rich also have control over what are called political machines. Tammany Hall in New York City is the most famous one. These are really strong political organizations that would do whatever it took in order to get reelected, reward their supporters, and the bosses of these organizations had enormous power, like Boss Tweed, again at Tammany Hall. This is part of the basic policy that government believed at the time, that government does not control business. And workers are like interchangeable parts. They're disposable, just like any other machine part. As I showed you earlier, there is a real urban crisis. There's a lack of proper sanitation. It's going to lead to disease spreading like wildfire. And a lot of the poor live in tenements. Those are really cheaply built, unsafe apartments. They tended to catch fire quickly. Even though they had fire escapes, they tended to be bolted on without actually design elements to make sure that they could survive. So sometimes when people were using the fire escape, in an emergency or not, the fire escape would collapse. So a lot of concerns there. We tend to see in cities, immigrants and minorities often had severe discrimination. The Chinese on the West Coast and groups like the Italians, the Irish on the East Coast. And workers have no rights. If the employer can find someone who will work for less, they can fire you. There's no safety. There's no possibility of joining a union. Long hours. We're talking 10, 12, 14-hour days, 6 days a week or longer. This here is a tenement. It's called a barbell tenement. And if you look at the size of the rooms, it's astonishing. Some of these are 6 foot by 9 foot. I'm 6 foot 2 inches tall. So the room is as wide as I am tall. That should give you an idea just how narrow these places are. One central hallway with one central stairwell. Yes, like I said, there is a fire escape, but they were not dependable by any stretch of the imagination. When you look inside these rooms at the tenements, it's pretty disturbing to see the lack of fire codes being followed. But just as importantly, it does show you that the poverty that people are living in at the time, that people do view as normal in the 1800s. As I said earlier, immigration is going to change America because Industrial Revolution requires workers. Now, the old style of immigrants were from Northern Europe, Scandinavia, England, Germany. In the 1840s onward, you're going to see mass increase of new immigrants. We're talking Italians, Greeks, Russians from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this is still a time where most Americans are expecting immigrants to assimilate. Now, assimilation is the idea that immigrants would get rid of their language, their culture, their beliefs, their religions, and they would adopt to quote-unquote American. In other words, the melting pot theory of immigration. As a class, we broke down this political cartoon during the lesson, and as you can see, you've got Lady Liberty, literally wearing the flag, trying to get all of these different groups of immigrants, again, these old-style immigrants, you can tell Scandinavian, German, these other little cultures. And then outside of the citizenship pot, you've got this angry person with a knife, almost kind of monkey-like face, and a green flag. And as the students rightly figured out, it's the Irish. The bottom, the caption says, the mortar of assimilation and the one element that won't mix. Again, implying the stereotype is true about the Irish, that they really aren't good as community members, that they do drink a lot, they fight a lot. We did some activities later on after this involving stereotyping. Stereotyping is going to have a huge impact. It's that idea of assigning permanent characteristics to people simply because of their race, or their belief system, or their ethnicity. We also examined some more modern views of immigration. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You're welcome to pause and go back and take a look at this. We just discussed what is the artist trying to explain here. And this is something in middle school we're expecting students to be able to do. To be able to look at a political cartoon or a document and not only understand what it's saying, why is it saying it? What is its ultimate message? All right. As we said, economic freedom, jobs is why the majority of immigrants are going to arrive at this time. During the Ellis Island years, 12 million immigrants are literally going to flow through the Ellis Island station. The Industrial Revolution is entirely dependent on unskilled labor, and immigrants provide that cheap, unskilled labor, which drives prices down and allows factory owners to make profits. In the early years, a lot of them work in sweatshops. Sweatshops are what makes clothing. So these are small factories in textiles with long working hours, very unsafe conditions. And unfortunately, as the immigrant population increases, also what's going to increase is anti-immigrant feelings. The nativist movement. Nativists believe that we need to focus on the internal problems of current Americans and we need to restrict migration. And so they're going to have a lot of successes at the time. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, for a decade, Chinese migration is essentially banned. They're not the only Asian group to be targeted. In 1908, Japan will see an agreement called the Gentleman's Agreement, where they will voluntarily restrict the number of immigrants. During World War I, you're going to see the passage of the Immigration Act, which is starting to move America in the direction of immigrants with skills. You got to be able to read and write in order to enter the United States. If you have any questions, please come see me. Otherwise, make sure you fill out your notes. This might be a good way to review what you've already covered. And don't forget that study guide. Have a good day.